The recording was made in 1931 on a wax cylinder that has degraded so badly you can barely hear what lies beneath the static. But if you listen closely, if you turn the volume up and press your ear against the speaker, you can hear them. 6 voices speaking in perfect unison, not the high, bright voices of children, but the low, weathered voice of an old woman. They are reciting something, a verse or a prayer, in a cadence that feels older than the words themselves. The cylinder was found in the basement of a psychiatric hospital in West Virginia that closed in 1958. There was no label, no date, no indication of who made the recording or why, but written on the cardboard sleeve in faded pencil were 3 words: the Mercer children. The hospital staff who found it refused to listen to it more than once. They said it made them feel as if someone were standing behind them, breathing on the back of their necks. They said the voices, those 6 identical voices, sounded like they were coming not from children's mouths, but from somewhere deep underground, as if the earth itself were speaking through them. Welcome to Beyond the Silent Woods. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. In the late summer of 1892, in the hills of southwestern Virginia, a woman named Constance Mercer gave birth to twins. The birth took place in her family's farmhouse, a weathered structure that sat at the end of a long dirt road, where the mountains pressed so close you could not see the sky until noon. The midwife who attended the birth was a woman named Ida Pullman, who had delivered half the Bobbies in Buchanan County over the past 30 years. Ida later told the local doctor that the birth had been difficult but not unusual, that the twins, both girls, had been healthy and strong, and that Constance had recovered well. Ida did not mention anything strange about the children. Not at first. It would be 3 years before anyone realized that something was profoundly wrong. Constance Mercer was 41 years old when she gave birth to the twins. She had been married to a man named Samuel Mercer for 20 years, and the twins were their 7th and 8th children. The Mercer family was known in the area as hardworking, religious, and deeply private. They attended the Baptist church in the nearby town of Grundy, but they kept to themselves otherwise, rarely socializing with neighbors or participating in community events. Samuel worked his land with a grim determination that some said bordered on obsession, clearing fields and planting crops in soil that most farmers had long ago given up on. Constance was described by those who knew her as a quiet woman, thin and severe, with eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice had a quality that made people uncomfortable, though they could not say why. It was low and rough, like stones grinding together, and it carried further than it should have, echoing in spaces where there should have been no echo. The twins were named Ruth and Esther. They grew as twins do, side by side, inseparable, learning to walk and speak in perfect synchrony. The Mercer family's older children, 5 boys and 1 girl, all ranged in age from 8 to 19, and they helped raise the twins while their parents worked the land. The family rarely came into town, and when they did, the children were quiet and well-behaved, standing in neat rows while Samuel purchased supplies at the general store. The storekeeper, a man named Henry Dalton, later recalled that the Mercer children always looked tired, as if they had not slept in days, and that they never smiled or spoke unless directly addressed. Henry said he had always found the family strange, but in a way that was common enough in these mountains, where isolation bred peculiarities that outsiders learned not to question. In the spring of 1895, when Ruth and Esther were 3 years old, Constance Mercer's mother died. The old woman's name was Abigail Crenshaw, and she had lived with the Mercers for the past decade, ever since Constance's father had passed. Abigail was 82 years old, blind in one eye, and confined to a chair in the parlor where she spent her days staring out the window at the mountains. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her voice was unmistakable. It was deep and rasping, damaged by years of smoking a clay pipe, and it had a strange rhythmic quality, as if every sentence were part of a longer song she was singing to herself. The children were terrified of her. The older Mercer children later told neighbors that their grandmother had frightened them since they were small, that she knew things she should not have known, that she would speak to them in the dark and tell them secrets about themselves that no one else could have known. When Abigail died in her sleep on the 14th of March, 1895, the family buried her in the small cemetery behind the house, and the older children were relieved. But the relief did not last long. 2 weeks after Abigail's death, the twins began to speak differently. Until that point, Ruth and Esther had babbled and cooed like any children their age, their voices high and sweet. But after the burial, their voices changed. They became lower, rougher, taking on the exact quality of their grandmother's voice. At first, Constance thought the children were imitating Abigail, that they had heard her speak so often they had learned to mimic her. But as the days passed, it became clear that this was not imitation. The twins spoke with Abigail's voice in every detail, the rasp, the rhythm, the strange echo that seemed to come from somewhere other than their mouths. And they spoke in unison always, as if sharing a single mind. When Ruth opened her mouth to speak, Esther spoke the same words at the same moment in the same tone with the same inflection. It was not a conversation. It was a duet performed with such precision that it sounded like one voice split between two bodies. Samuel Mercer was disturbed by this development, but he was a practical man who did not believe in the supernatural. He told Constance that the children would grow out of it, that it was a phase, a strange habit they had picked up and would abandon as they matured. Constance was not so sure. She had grown up listening to her mother's voice, and she knew it in a way that went beyond sound. She knew the cadence, the pauses, the way certain words were drawn out and others clipped short. And what she heard coming from her daughters' mouths was not an imitation. It was identical. Constance began to watch the twins closely, and what she saw frightened her. The children moved in synchrony, not just when they spoke, but always. They walked in step, reached for objects at the same moment, turned their heads in the same direction at the same instant. It was as if they were puppets controlled by the same invisible hand. In June of 1895, Constance took the twins to see Dr. Edwin Marsh, the only physician within 20 miles. Dr. Marsh examined the children and found them physically healthy. Their throats showed no signs of damage or abnormality. Their lungs were strong. There was no medical reason for their voices to sound the way they did. When Dr. Marsh asked the twins to speak, they answered in unison, in that low, grinding voice that belonged to a woman 40 years older. Dr. Marsh was unsettled, but he had no explanation. He told Constance that the children were likely imitating their grandmother as a form of grief, and that with time and correction, they would revert to normal speech patterns. He advised her to discourage the behavior, to correct the twins every time they spoke in unison or used that voice. Constance tried. For months, she corrected them, scolded them, begged them to speak like children. The twins only stared at her with blank expressions and continued to speak in their grandmother's voice. By the fall of 1895, the entire Mercer household was in turmoil. The older children refused to be alone with the twins. They said Ruth and Esther knew things they should not know, that they spoke about events that had happened before they were born, that they recited conversations word for word that they could not possibly have overheard. Samuel's oldest son, a boy of 19 named Caleb, told his father that the twins had described to him, in perfect detail, a trip Caleb had taken to town 3 years earlier, when the twins had not yet been born. Caleb said they had told him what he had said to the storekeeper, what he had purchased, even what he had been thinking as he walked home. Caleb said the twins had smiled as they spoke, not with the innocent smile of children, but with the knowing smile of someone much older, someone who saw through him completely. Samuel Mercer decided to take action. In November of 1895, he wrote to his brother, a man named Josiah Mercer, who lived in Tennessee and was known in the family as a man of learning and reason. Samuel described the situation with the twins and asked Josiah to come and assess the children. Josiah arrived in early December. He was a school teacher, a man in his 50s with a skeptical mind and little patience for superstition. He spent a week with the family, observing the twins, speaking with them, testing them. On the night before he left, Josiah sat with Samuel in the parlor and told him what he had found. Josiah said the twins were not imitating their grandmother. He said their speech patterns were too precise, too consistent, too deeply ingrained to be a learned behavior. He said he had tested them by asking questions only Abigail could have answered, questions about events that had occurred decades before the twins were born, and the twins had answered every question correctly, speaking in unison, in Abigail's voice. Josiah said he did not believe in ghosts or possession, but that he had no rational explanation for what he had witnessed. He advised Samuel to seek help from the church, because whatever was happening to the twins was beyond the reach of medicine or education. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Beyond the Silent Woods, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Samuel Mercer was a proud man, and the suggestion that he seek help from the church felt like an admission of defeat. But by the spring of 1896, he had no choice. The twins had begun to speak not just with their grandmother's voice, but with her knowledge. They told stories about Constance's childhood, about Samuel's youth, about events that had happened before they were born, and that no one had ever spoken of in their presence. They spoke of secrets, of sins, of things buried and forgotten. The older Mercer children became terrified of them. Caleb left the farm and moved to Kentucky, saying he could no longer sleep under the same roof as the twins. The second oldest son, Matthew, began drinking heavily and refused to speak to his sisters. The only daughter, a girl of 15 named Lee, began to have nightmares in which her grandmother stood at the foot of her bed and whispered to her in that grinding voice, telling her things Lee did not want to know. In April of 1896, Samuel brought the twins to see Reverend Thomas Albright, the pastor of the Baptist church in Grundy. Reverend Albright was an elderly man, stern and unyielding in his faith, and he had little tolerance for what he considered the superstitions of the uneducated. But when he met the twins, his confidence faltered. He asked them to recite the Lord's Prayer, and they did, in unison, in Abigail's voice. He asked them to tell him about their grandmother, and they spoke for 20 minutes without pause, describing Abigail's life in detail, her childhood in North Carolina, her marriage, her children, her thoughts and fears and regrets. Reverend Albright stopped them and asked how they knew these things. The twins smiled and said their grandmother had told them. Reverend Albright asked when. The twins said she told them every night when the house was dark and everyone else was asleep. Reverend Albright felt a chill run through him. He asked the twins where their grandmother was now. The twins said she was standing right behind him. Reverend Albright left the church that day and did not return for 3 weeks. When he finally came back, he told Samuel that he could not help, that what afflicted the twins was beyond the reach of prayer or scripture, and that Samuel should consider sending the children away. Samuel asked where he should send them. Reverend Albright said he did not know, but that keeping them in the house was dangerous, not just for the family, but for the children themselves. He said he believed the twins were not possessed in the traditional sense, but that something had attached itself to them, something that had used Abigail as a vessel, and was now using the twins to continue existing in the world. He said the longer the twins remained with the family, the stronger the attachment would grow, until there was nothing left of Ruth and Esther but the voice, the knowledge, the presence that had once been Abigail. Samuel did not send the twins away. He could not bring himself to do it. They were his daughters, and despite everything, he loved them, but he isolated them. He moved them to a small room on the second floor of the house, away from the other children, and he locked the door at night. Constance brought them meals and spent time with them during the day, but she no longer slept in the same wing of the house. The twins did not protest. They sat in their room, side by side, and spoke to each other in their grandmother's voice, telling stories that no children should know, laughing at jokes that had no humor, staring out the window at the mountains with eyes that seemed far too old for their faces. In the summer of 1896, something changed. The twins stopped speaking to anyone but each other. When Constance or Samuel entered their room, The twins would fall silent and stare, their eyes tracking every movement with an intensity that made it difficult to breathe. The older children refused to go near the second floor. Lee, the only daughter, began to sleepwalk, and the family would find her standing outside the twins' door, her hand on the knob, as if she were about to open it but could not remember why. Samuel nailed the door shut. He told himself it was for safety, to keep Lee from wandering into the room, but in truth, he was afraid of what might come out. In September of 1896, Constance gave birth to another child. It was unexpected. Constance was 45 years old and she had assumed her childbearing years were over. The child was a boy and they named him Isaac. The birth was attended by Ida Pullman, the same midwife who had delivered the twins 4 years earlier. Ida later told Dr. Marsh that the birth had been normal, but that Constance had been in a state of terror throughout the labor, clutching Ida's hand and whispering over and over that she could not let the twins near the baby. Ida did not understand, and Constance would not explain. When Isaac was born, Constance held him close and wept, not with joy, but with a grief so profound that Ida said it felt like a funeral. Isaac grew quickly, a healthy, happy child who filled the house with noise and light. For a time, the family felt almost normal. The twins remained locked in their room, and the older children began to relax. Samuel allowed himself to hope that the worst was over, that the twins would eventually grow out of whatever afflicted them, and that Isaac would grow up untouched by the darkness that had consumed his sisters. But that hope was short-lived. When Isaac was 6 months old, he began to babble. It is a normal stage of development, the sounds a child makes as they learn to form words. But Isaac's babbling was different. It was low and rough, like stones grinding together, and it had a rhythmic quality that made Constance's blood run cold. She listened to her son in his crib, and she heard, faintly but unmistakably, the beginning of her mother's voice. Constance took Isaac to Dr. Marsh. The doctor examined the child and found nothing wrong. He said Isaac's vocal cords were developing normally, and that the quality of his babbling was likely just an unusual variation. Constance asked if it was possible for a child to inherit the voice of someone they had never met. Dr. Marsh said it was not. That voice was shaped by physiology and environment, not by lineage. Constance went home and locked herself in her bedroom and prayed for the first time in years. By the time Isaac was a year old, his babbling had resolved into words, and the words came out in Abigail's voice. Not the high, tentative voice of a toddler learning to speak, but the deep, grinding voice of an old woman. Samuel and Constance tried to tell themselves it was coincidence, that all children sounded different, and that Isaac would develop his own voice as he grew. But when Isaac spoke his first full sentence at 18 months, speaking in perfect unison with the twins who were locked 2 floors above him, speaking words he should not have known in a voice he should not have had, Samuel finally broke. He stood in the parlor and screamed at the ceiling, demanding to know what his family had done to deserve this, what sin they were being punished for. The twins, locked in their room, laughed. It was a sound like wind through a crack in the rocks, and it echoed through the house long after Samuel had collapsed to his knees. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Beyond the Silent Woods, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In the winter of 1897, Lee Mercer, the 15-year-old daughter, disappeared. She left no note, took nothing with her, simply walked out of the house one morning and never returned. Samuel organized a search, and neighbors combed the mountains for days, but they found no trace of her. Some believed she had run away, unable to bear living in a house where her siblings spoke with the voice of the dead. Others whispered darker theories, that the twins had done something to her, that Lee had been taken by the same force that had taken Ruth and Esther. Samuel reported the disappearance to the county sheriff, a man named Clayton Vickers, who came to the Mercer farm and interviewed the family. Sheriff Vickers later wrote in his report that the Mercer household was the most disturbing place he had ever entered, that the children spoke in a voice that made his skin crawl, and that he left with the distinct feeling that Lee had been right to run. 2 months after Lee's disappearance, her body was found in a ravine 3 miles from the Mercer farm. She had fallen or been pushed from a cliff, and her neck was broken. The county coroner ruled the death accidental, but Sheriff Vickers was not convinced. He noted in his report that Lee had no reason to be in that part of the mountains, that it was far from any trail or road, and that the cliff she had fallen from was difficult to reach. He interviewed the Mercer family again, but they had no answers. Samuel said Lee had been troubled, that she had been sleepwalking, that perhaps she had wandered in her sleep and lost her way. Constance said nothing. The twins, when asked, said that Lee had wanted to leave, that she had been afraid, and that she should have stayed. Sheriff Vickers asked what they meant. The twins smiled and said Lee would understand now. Sheriff Vickers left the farm and never returned. Lee's death shattered what remained of the Mercer family. The older boys left one by one, moving to other counties, other states, cutting ties with their parents and siblings. By the end of 1897, only Samuel, Constance, the twins, and Isaac remained in the farmhouse. The house itself began to decay, as if the weight of what was happening inside was breaking it down from within. The roof leaked, the floors sagged, the walls cracked. Samuel stopped working the land. He spent his days sitting in the parlor, staring at nothing, while Constance moved through the house like a ghost, feeding the children, cleaning, praying in whispers that no one answered. In the spring of 1898, Constance gave birth again, another boy. They named him Abel. Constance did not weep this time. She did not feel anything. She held the child and waited because she knew what was coming. Abel spoke his first words at 14 months. They came out in Abigail's voice. Constance was not surprised. She placed Abel in a crib next to Isaac's, and she listened as the two boys babbled to each other in perfect synchrony, in the voice of a woman who had been dead for 3 years. The twins, still locked in their room, began to sing. It was a song Abigail used to sing, a hymn from her childhood, and the boys in their cribs sang along, their voices blending into a single chorus that filled the house day and night. Dr. Marsh visited the farm in the summer of 1898, at the request of a neighbor who was concerned about the family. The doctor found Samuel barely responsive, Constance thin and hollow-eyed, and 4 children, all speaking in the same voice. Dr. Marsh wrote in his notes that he had never encountered anything like it, that the children were physically healthy but psychologically abnormal in a way that defied classification. He recommended that the family be evaluated by a specialist, perhaps someone from the state hospital in Richmond. Samuel refused. He said his family would not be put on display, would not be examined like animals in a zoo. Dr. Marsh left, and he wrote a letter to the State Board of Health, but no one came. In 1899, Constance gave birth to twins again, 2 more girls. She named them Sarah and Hannah. She did not have the strength to fight anymore. She knew what they would become, and she was right. By the time Sarah and Hannah were a year old, they spoke in Abigail's voice, moving and speaking in perfect unison with Ruth and Esther, who were now 7. The 4 girls sat together in the twins' room, which Samuel had finally unlocked because there seemed no point in keeping them apart, and they spoke to each other in that low, grinding voice, telling stories that spanned decades, reciting conversations that had taken place before any of them were born. The boys, Isaac and Abel, joined them when they were old enough to climb the stairs, and the 6 children formed a chorus that never stopped, day or night, speaking, singing, laughing in a voice that belonged to none of them. Samuel Mercer died in 1900. He was 51 years old. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but those who saw his body said he looked like a man who had simply given up, who had decided that living was no longer worth the effort. Constance buried him in the cemetery behind the house, next to her mother and daughter, and she returned to the farmhouse alone. Alone, that is, except for the 6 children who spoke with one voice, who moved as one, who watched her with eyes that were not entirely their own. Constance stopped speaking after Samuel's death. She went through the motions of caring for the children, but she did not speak to them, did not answer when they called to her in their grandmother's voice, did not acknowledge them when they told her things about her past, about her sins, about the secrets she had kept. The children did not seem to mind. They continued their endless conversations, their songs, their recitations, and Constance moved through the house like a shadow, silent and insubstantial. In 1902, a reporter from the Richmond Times-Dispatch traveled to Buchanan County to investigate rumors of a family afflicted by a strange malady. The reporter's name was Jonathan Pierce, and he had heard from a contact at the state hospital about a doctor's report concerning children who all spoke with the same voice. Jonathan arrived at the Mercer farm on a cold afternoon in October. He knocked on the door, and Constance answered. She did not speak, but she stepped aside and let him enter. Jonathan walked through the house, and he heard them. 6 voices speaking in perfect unison, a low, grinding voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He followed the sound to a room on the 2nd floor and found the children sitting in a circle on the floor. They were of varying ages, from 3 to 10, but they moved identically, their heads turning in unison as he entered, their eyes locking onto him with the same expression of mild curiosity. Jonathan asked the children their names. They answered in unison in that voice: Ruth, Esther, Isaac, Abel, Sarah, Hannah. Jonathan asked them how old they were. They told him, speaking as one. Jonathan asked them who taught them to speak like that. The children smiled and said their grandmother taught them. Jonathan asked where their grandmother was. The children said she was here, that she had always been here, that she would always be here. Jonathan felt his hands begin to shake. He asked the children if they understood that their grandmother was dead. The children said death is not an ending, it is a doorway, and their grandmother had walked through the doorway and found a way back. Jonathan Pierce left the Mercer farm that afternoon and wrote an article that was never published. The editors at the Times-Dispatch read his draft and decided it was too disturbing, too unbelievable, and that publishing it would only invite ridicule. Jonathan kept the draft, and it was found in his papers after his death in 1943. In it he wrote, "I have reported on murders, disasters, and atrocities, but I have never felt the kind of primal fear I felt in that house. The children are not children. They are vessels, and something old and patient is using them to stay in the world. I do not know what it wants. I do not know if it wants anything. But I know that it is not done, and that it will continue to spread, one child at a time, until there is no one left who remembers what the children used to be." If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Beyond the Silent Woods, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In 1904, Constance Mercer gave birth to her final child, a girl. She named her Grace. Constance was 53 years old and the birth nearly killed her. Dr. Marsh was summoned to the farm and found Constance hemorrhaging, barely conscious. He managed to stop the bleeding, but he told her she was too old to survive another pregnancy and that she should take measures to ensure there would not be one. Constance did not respond. She held Grace to her chest and closed her eyes, and Dr. Marsh left her there, knowing he would likely never see her alive again. Grace began to speak at 11 months. Her first words came out in Abigail's voice. Constance, who had not spoken in 4 years, finally broke her silence. She screamed. It was a sound that carried across the mountains, a howl of rage and despair that neighbors a mile away heard and later said made their blood freeze. Constance screamed for hours, and when she finally stopped, she took Grace and walked out of the house. She walked into the mountains with the child in her arms, and she did not come back. A search party found Constance's body 2 days later in a cave high in the hills. She had frozen to death, curled around the baby, who was still alive, still warm, still speaking in that low, grinding voice. The men who found them said Grace had been talking when they arrived, reciting something that sounded like a prayer or a spell, and that when they picked her up, she looked at them and smiled and said, in Abigail's voice, that her mother had tried to stop it but it was too late, that the line would continue, that there would always be more. Grace was taken back to the farm where her 6 siblings cared for her. The oldest, Ruth and Esther, were now 12. They fed Grace, changed her, sang to her, all in that single, shared voice. The children lived alone in the farmhouse for 3 years, and somehow they survived. Neighbors brought food occasionally, leaving it on the porch and refusing to enter. The children did not go to school, did not interact with anyone, did not leave the property. They simply existed, a collective consciousness inhabiting 7 bodies, speaking with one voice, living as one entity divided among many. In 1907, a decision was made by the county to remove the children from the farm. The decision came after a schoolteacher named Margaret Henson visited the property and returned to town in a state of shock, reporting that the children were living in squalor, unsupervised, and speaking in a manner that suggested severe psychological disturbance. The county sheriff, now a man named Eugene Watkins, arrived at the farm with a doctor and a representative from the state orphanage. They found the children healthy, clean, and calm. The house, against all expectations, was well maintained. The children greeted the officials politely, speaking in unison, and when asked if they would like to leave the farm, they said they would go wherever they were told because it did not matter, because they were all going to the same place eventually. The children were placed in the Blue Ridge Orphanage in southwestern Virginia. The staff at the orphanage were warned that the children were unusual, but nothing could have prepared them for what arrived. 7 children, ranging in age from 3 to 15, who moved in perfect synchrony, who spoke in one voice, who seemed to share thoughts and sensations. The staff tried to separate them, placing them in different dormitories, but it made no difference. At night, the children would speak to each other across the building, their voices carrying through walls and floors, holding conversations as if they were sitting side by side. The other children in the orphanage were terrified. They refused to sleep in the same rooms as the Mercer children, and some began to have nightmares in which an old woman stood at the foot of their beds and whispered to them in a voice like grinding stones. Within 6 months, 3 of the orphanage's residents had begun to speak differently. Their voices had changed, becoming lower, rougher, taking on the quality of the Mercer children's voices. The staff was horrified. They isolated the affected children, but it continued. By the end of 1908, 6 non-Mercer children were speaking in Abigail's voice, and the orphanage's director, a woman named Eleanor Finch, wrote to the State Board of Health begging for help. She wrote, "We are losing them. One by one, the children are being taken by something we cannot see, cannot fight, cannot understand. The Mercer children sit in the common room and smile, and every day another child begins to sound like them. We cannot stop it. We do not know how." The State Board of Health sent an investigator, a man named Dr. Victor Brennan, who specialized in childhood psychological disorders. Dr. Brennan spent 2 weeks at the orphanage, observing the children, conducting interviews, running tests. His report, filed in January of 1909, is one of the most disturbing documents in the Virginia State Archives. Dr. Brennan wrote that he could find no medical explanation for what was happening. The affected children showed no signs of physical illness, no damage to their vocal cords or respiratory systems. Their speech patterns were learned, but learned so perfectly and so rapidly that it defied any known mechanism of imitation. Dr. Brennan noted that the affected children spoke not just with the same voice, but with the same knowledge. They recited events from decades past, described people they had never met, knew things about the orphanage staff that no one had told them. Dr. Brennan concluded his report with a recommendation that shocked the board. He advised that the Mercer children be placed in permanent isolation, quarantined from all other children, because he believed they were contagious, though he could not say what they were transmitting or how. The Mercer children were transferred in the spring of 1909 to a facility in the mountains of West Virginia, a place that was not quite a hospital and not quite a prison. It was called the Laurel Ridge Institute, and it housed individuals who were considered too disturbed or too dangerous for standard institutions. The children were placed in a wing of the building that had been hastily converted for their use, a series of small rooms connected by a central hallway. They were kept separate from the other residents, and the staff were instructed to minimize contact. But minimizing contact did not prevent the spread. Within a year, 2 staff members at Laurel Ridge began to speak differently. Their voices changed, becoming lower, rougher, sounding more and more like the Mercer children. One was a nurse named Patricia Hollies, who had spent hours each day caring for the children. The other was a custodian named Frank Delaney, who had cleaned their wing and sometimes sat with them during meals. Patricia and Frank did not know each other well, had never had a conversation of more than a few words, but they began to speak in perfect unison, in Abigail's voice. They were removed from their positions and placed in the facility as patients. The Mercer children smiled when they saw Patricia and Frank in the common room, and they welcomed them, speaking to them as if they were old friends, as if they had always been part of the family. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Beyond the Silent Woods, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The director of Laurel Ridge Institute, a psychiatrist named Dr. Arnold Thorne, began to document what he called the Mercer phenomenon in a series of journals that were discovered after the facility closed in 1958. Dr. Thorne was a rational man, trained in the latest methods of psychological treatment, and he did not believe in the supernatural. But over the course of a decade, his journals chart his descent from skepticism to something close to terror. He wrote extensively about the children, about their behavior, their speech, their effect on those around them. He noted that the transmission of the voice seemed to require prolonged exposure, that those who spent more than a few hours per day with the Mercer children were at risk, while those who maintained distance remained unaffected. He theorized that the phenomenon was psychological, a form of mass hysteria or shared delusion, but he could not explain why the affected individuals all acquired the same specific knowledge, the same memories, the same voice. In 1914, Dr. Thorne attempted an experiment. He brought in a specialist from Johns Hopkins University, a psychologist named Dr. Helen Carter, who had never met the Mercer children and knew nothing of their history. Dr. Thorne asked Dr. Carter to spend 1 week at the facility, conducting assessments of the children and the affected staff. Dr. Carter agreed. She arrived on a Monday in late October and began her work immediately. She interviewed each of the Mercer children individually, asking about their childhoods, their parents, their grandmother. The children answered her questions in unison, even though they were in separate rooms. Dr. Carter, listening to the recordings later, was unnerved by the precision of their synchrony. By Thursday, Dr. Carter began to complain of headaches and difficulty sleeping. By Saturday, her voice had changed. Dr. Thorne recorded her final interview, in which Dr. Carter spoke in Abigail's voice, describing events from Abigail's childhood, reciting prayers Abigail had learned as a girl, telling stories about Abigail's marriage and children. Dr. Carter had no way of knowing these things. She had never been to Virginia, had never met anyone from the Mercer family, had never heard Abigail's voice. Butch spoke as Abigail, and when Dr. Thorne asked her how she knew these things, she smiled and said Abigail had told her. That Abigail was always telling, always speaking, always teaching, and that anyone who listened long enough would learn. Dr. Carter was placed in the facility as a patient. She remained there until her death in 1946, speaking always in Abigail's voice, moving and thinking in synchrony with the Mercer children and the other affected individuals. Dr. Thorne stopped bringing in outside specialists. He wrote in his journal, "We are not dealing with a psychological phenomenon. This is something else, something older, something that has found a way to persist beyond the death of the body." Abigail Crenshaw is not gone. She is here, living in these children and these staff, and she will continue to live in anyone who spends too long in her presence. I do not know how to stop it. I do not know if it can be stopped. By 1920, there were 17 individuals at Laurel Ridge who spoke in Abigail's voice. 7 were the original Mercer children, now adults ranging in age from 18 to 28. The rest were staff or other patients who had been exposed. They lived together in the converted wing, moving as a collective, speaking as one, and Dr. Thorne observed them with a mixture of fascination and dread. He noted that they showed no signs of distress or unhappiness. They did not fight, did not argue, did not express individual desires or preferences. They simply existed, a hive mind inhabiting multiple bodies, content to sit together and speak in that endless, grinding voice, reciting the memories of a woman who had died 25 years earlier. In 1923, Ruth Mercer, the oldest of the original twins, became pregnant. It was unclear how, as the affected individuals were kept separate from the general population and were not known to engage in sexual relationships. Dr. Thorne investigated and found no evidence of assault or misconduct. Ruth herself, when asked, said only that it was time, that the line had to continue. She gave birth in the spring of 1924 to a daughter. They named her Abigail. The child was born speaking, not crying, not wailing, but speaking in full sentences in her grandmother's voice. The midwife who attended the birth, a woman named Clara Jensen, left the facility immediately afterward and refused to return. She told Dr. Thorne that she had delivered hundreds of bobbies, but she had never seen a newborn speak, and that what came out of that child's mouth was not the sound of a baby learning to vocalize, but the sound of someone old, someone who had been speaking for a very long time. Dr. Thorne examined the child and found her physically normal. Her vocal cords, her lungs, her throat, all were formed as they should be. But when baby Abigail opened her mouth, what emerged was the voice of her great-great-grandmother, low and rough and impossibly old. Over the next decade, more of the affected women at Laurel Ridge became pregnant. The fathers were unknown, unidentified, and the women would not or could not explain. They gave birth to children who spoke from the moment they entered the world, children who moved in synchrony with the others, children who were, from birth, part of the collective. By 1935, there were 43 individuals at Laurel Ridge who spoke in Abigail's voice, and the facility was struggling to contain them. The State Board of Health considered shutting the facility down, relocating the affected individuals to separate institutions, but Dr. Thorne warned against it. He said that separating them would not stop the spread, that it would only scatter the phenomenon, that Abigail would continue to reproduce, to infect, to persist, and that the only hope of controlling it was to keep them all in one place. The recording I mentioned at the beginning of this story, the wax cylinder found in the basement of the facility after it closed, was made in 1931. It was one of several recordings Dr. Thorne made in an attempt to document the phenomenon, to capture evidence that might someday help someone understand what was happening. The recording features 6 children, all under the age of 10, all born at the facility, all speaking in perfect unison in Abigail's voice. They are reciting something, a verse that Dr. Thorne could not identify, something that sounds like a prayer but is not from any known religious text. The words are old, possibly not even English, and they repeat over and over in a rhythm that burrows into your mind and refuses to leave. The children speak with absolute conviction, as if they are reciting a truth so fundamental that questioning it would be absurd. And beneath their voices, if you listen very carefully, you can hear something else. A sound like breathing, a sound like wind moving through a narrow space, a sound like the earth itself, shifting and settling, waiting. Dr. Thorne died in 1937. The cause of death was listed as a stroke, but his final journal entry, written the night before he died, tells a different story. He wrote, "I have been listening too long. I have spent too many hours in their presence, and now I hear it, the voice, not outside but inside. It has been growing in me for years, slowly, patiently, and now it is louder than my own thoughts. I know things I should not know. I remember things that never happened to me. I am losing myself, and in another few days I will be gone entirely. They will find me speaking with the others, and I will be just another body carrying the voice. I do not know if I should be afraid. Part of me is relieved. It is so tiring to be alone." When Dr. Thorne died, his replacement, a young psychiatrist named Dr. Michael Green, ordered that the affected individuals be recorded more extensively. Dr. Green believed that modern recording technology might capture something that would explain the phenomenon, some frequency or pattern in the voice that could be analyzed and understood. Over the next 2 decades, hundreds of hours of recordings were made. Most were destroyed or lost when the facility closed, but a few survived. The wax cylinder is one. There are others, stored in archives, in university basements, in the collections of private individuals who do not know what they have. I have listened to some of them. They all sound the same. The voice, grinding and low, speaking words that are sometimes English and sometimes not, reciting memories that belong to a woman who died in 1895 and who has refused, for reasons no one understands, to let go. Laurel Ridge Institute closed in 1958. The stated reason was budget cuts and changes in mental health policy, but those who worked there knew the truth. The facility was closing because it could no longer be controlled, because the number of affected individuals was growing faster than the staff could manage, and because the phenomenon was beginning to spread beyond the facility's walls. Visitors, delivery workers, even state inspectors who spent a few hours on the grounds began to report changes in their voices, changes in their thoughts. The decision was made to shut it down, to disperse the residents to other institutions, and to hope that separation would slow the spread. It did not. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to Beyond the Silent Woods, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The residents of Laurel Ridge were transferred to facilities across Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. Within 5 years, reports began to emerge from those facilities of staff and patients speaking in a strange, grinding voice, moving in synchrony, reciting memories that were not their own. Some facilities isolated the affected individuals immediately. Others did not recognize the signs until it was too late. By the mid-1960s, there were over 200 confirmed cases of what researchers were now calling Crenshaw syndrome, named after Abigail, the woman who had started it all. The Centers for Disease Control sent investigators, but they found no pathogen, no virus, no bacteria. Neurologists examined the affected individuals and found no abnormalities in brain structure or function. Linguists analyzed the voice and found nothing unusual except its consistency across dozens of individuals who had never met. The last known member of the original Mercer family, a woman named Grace Mercer, died in 1974. She was 70 years old and she had spent her entire life speaking in her grandmother's voice. She died in a facility in Ohio, surrounded by others like her, and her final words, recorded by a nurse, were, "It does not end here. It never ends. We are the line and the line continues." Grace was cremated, as were all the affected individuals who died in state care, because there was a fear, unspoken but pervasive, that burying them might somehow allow the phenomenon to spread into the earth itself, to root and grow like a fungus. But the phenomenon did not need bodies to spread. It needed only exposure, attention, time. In the 1980s, a psychology graduate student named Corinne Mitchell wrote her dissertation on Crenshaw syndrome. She interviewed survivors, listened to recordings, read Dr. Thorne's journals. She spent 2 years immersed in the case, and by the time she defended her dissertation, her voice had changed. Her committee noticed immediately. Corinne spoke in the same low, grinding tone that characterized the affected individuals, and she recited facts about Abigail Crenshaw's life that were not in any of the documents she had reviewed. Corinne withdrew from the program and checked herself into a psychiatric facility, where she remains to this day, speaking in Abigail's voice, part of a collective that now numbers in the hundreds. There are, as of 2023, at least 300 confirmed cases of Crenshaw syndrome worldwide. Most are in the United States, but there are cases in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, spread by researchers, journalists, and curious individuals who listened too long to the recordings, who read too deeply into the case, who allowed themselves to be drawn into the mystery. The voice, it seems, can travel through recordings, through written descriptions, through focused attention. It does not require physical presence. It requires only that you listen. I have been working on this case for 2 years. I have listened to the recordings, dozens of them, hundreds of hours of that grinding, hypnotic voice. I have read the journals, the reports, the interviews. I have spoken with descendants of the Mercer family, with staff who worked at the facilities, with researchers who studied the phenomenon and paid the price. And I have begun to notice changes. Small things at first. A roughness in my throat in the morning. A tendency to speak in rhythms I do not recognize. Memories that do not belong to me. Fragments of a life lived in the 1800s in the mountains of Virginia. I tell myself it is suggestion, that I am imagining it, that spending so much time immersed in this case has made me paranoid. But I am not sure I believe that anymore. Yesterday I was recording a voiceover for this episode and I played it back to check the sound quality. I heard my voice, but underneath it, barely audible, was another voice. Lower, rougher, speaking the same words a fraction of a second behind me, like an echo that came before the sound. I deleted the recording and tried again. The second voice was there again, more distinct this time. I stopped recording. I sat in silence and tried to convince myself I was tired, that I needed rest, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But I know better. I have heard that voice too many times in too many recordings, spoken by too many people, and now it is in me. I do not know how long I have. Dr. Thorne lasted years. Dr. Carter lasted days. Perhaps it depends on resistance, on how much you fight, on how tightly you hold to your own identity. Or perhaps it depends on nothing at all, on something arbitrary and unknowable, like how deeply the voice has decided to root itself in you. I am going to finish this episode. I am going to publish it, because people deserve to know what happened to the Mercer family, what is still happening, what may happen to anyone who listens too closely. But I want you to understand something. If you have made it this far, if you have listened to this entire story, you have been exposed. Not as intensely as I have, not as deeply as the researchers and the staff and the family members, but you have been exposed nonetheless. You have heard me describe the voice, and in describing it, I have given you a piece of it. You may feel nothing. You may forget this story tomorrow and move on with your life. Or you may, weeks or months or years from now, notice a change, a roughness in your voice, a memory that does not belong to you, a sense that someone else is speaking through you, using your mouth, living in the spaces you thought were yours alone. I do not say this to frighten you. I say it because it is the truth, and the truth is what I have spent 2 years trying to find. The truth is that Abigail Crenshaw died in 1895, but she did not leave. She found a way to stay, using her grandchildren as vessels, and then their children, and then anyone who listened, anyone who paid attention, anyone who opened themselves to the possibility that a voice could outlive a body. She is still here. She is in the recordings, in the documents, in the memories of those who have studied her, and she is patient. She does not demand immediate surrender. She waits, slowly weaving herself into your thoughts, your speech, your identity. Until one day, you look in the mirror and do not recognize the voice that comes out of your mouth. The question that haunts me, the question that I cannot answer, is why? Why does Abigail persist? What does she want? Is she aware of what she is doing, or is this simply a biological echo, a pattern repeating mindlessly across time? And if she is aware, if there is intention behind the spread, what is her purpose? I have found no answers. The affected individuals, when asked, say only that it is necessary, that the line must continue, that something must be preserved. But they will not say what. Or they cannot. Or the answer is something our minds cannot process, something that requires speaking in unison across 100 throats before it can be fully expressed. I leave you with one final piece of evidence. 2 weeks ago, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, no note, just a small wooden box wrapped in brown paper. Inside the box was a wax cylinder, older than the one found at Laurel Ridge, the surface worn and scratched. I have not played it yet. I am afraid of what I will hear, afraid that this final recording will be the thing that pushes me over the edge, that transforms me completely into another vessel for Abigail's voice. But I know I will play it eventually. I cannot stop myself. The curiosity is too strong, the need to know too powerful. And when I play it, when I listen to whatever was recorded on that cylinder over 100 years ago, I will become part of the story I have been telling. I will join the chorus. And somewhere, in some facility or home or institution, someone else will begin to speak in Abigail's voice, and the line will continue. This is Beyond the Silent Woods. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay cautious.